Some people think the most expensive promise is the one you break. They're wrong. It's the one you make when you believe you'll never have to keep it. My name is Claire Bennett, and exactly 1 year ago, I agreed to marry the most feared man in New York for $50 million. At the time, I thought I was making the smartest financial decision of my life. I had no idea I was signing away the only future I had ever planned for myself. The morning everything changed smelled like burnt coffee and bad news. My office overlooked Midtown Manhattan, but the skyline that usually inspired me felt distant through the rain streaking across the glass. 3 generations of my family's investment firm were about to disappear because one trusted partner had hidden years of fraudulent accounts behind polished presentations and confident smiles. By the time I uncovered the truth, every lender had walked away. Every investor wanted answers I couldn't give. I sat alone in the conference room long after everyone else had left, staring at numbers that refused to become anything except a disaster. $50 million. That was the exact amount needed to save everything my grandfather had spent 40 years building. It might as well have been $5 billion. My phone buzzed just after 7. The message contained only an address on Fifth Avenue and a single sentence. If saving your company matters more than your pride, be there at 8. There was no signature. I should have deleted it. Instead, I found myself standing outside one of Manhattan's oldest private clubs an hour later, surrounded by polished black SUVs and men in tailored suits who somehow managed to look invisible while watching everything. The hostess didn't ask my name. She simply smiled and escorted me upstairs to a quiet dining room overlooking Central Park. Only one man occupied the room. Alexander Knight stood beside the window with one hand resting in his pocket, the city lights reflecting against the glass behind him. Every newspaper had called him a billionaire entrepreneur. Every whispered conversation called him something else. He turned toward me with calm gray eyes that revealed nothing. His charcoal suit looked perfectly tailored, but it wasn't the expensive fabric that unsettled me. It was the silence. The kind of silence powerful people carried because they never needed to raise their voices. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please sit." His tone was polite, almost gentle. Somehow that made me even more nervous. A server appeared, poured coffee, then disappeared without either of us asking. Alexander waited until the door closed before sliding a thin folder across the table. Inside was every detail of my financial collapse, every overdue payment, every confidential negotiation I thought no one else knew existed. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Fear has a strange way of becoming clarity. "You investigated me," I said quietly. "I prefer to understand people before making important offers," he replied. I closed the folder. "And what exactly are you offering?" He looked directly into my eyes for the first time that evening. $50 million. Every debt disappears tomorrow morning. Your employees keep their jobs. Your family's name survives. My throat tightened. Nobody gives away that kind of money. "You're right," he said with the faintest hint of a smile. "I don't." "Then tell me the price." His answer came without hesitation, without drama, as if he were discussing tomorrow's weather instead of rewriting my life forever. "Marry me for 1 year, Claire. After that, if you still want to leave, we'll discuss it." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The ticking of an antique clock somewhere beyond the dining room suddenly sounded louder than the traffic outside. I searched Alexander's face for any trace of humor, any sign that this was some elaborate joke designed to humiliate a desperate woman. I found nothing. His expression remained calm, almost patient, as though he had already calculated every possible response I could give. I folded my hands together to stop them from shaking. "You cannot possibly expect me to say yes." He reached for his coffee without looking away from me. "I expect you to make the decision that matters most to you. Family, legacy, pride, survival. Everyone has a price, Claire. The difference is that most people never admit it." I wanted to argue. I wanted to stand up, walk out, and prove him wrong. Instead, my thoughts drifted to the faces of the 83 employees whose paychecks depended on my next move. I remembered my grandfather teaching me how to read financial statements when I was 12 years old, telling me that numbers always revealed the truth even when people refused to. The truth now was painfully simple. Without $50 million, everything would disappear within days. I looked back at the contract resting inside the folder. It was surprisingly short. A legal marriage lasting 1 year. Complete financial independence. separate personal assets, absolute confidentiality. At the end of 12 months, either party could request a divorce. There were no impossible demands, no hidden conditions that I could see. It almost looked reasonable. That frightened me more than anything. Why me? I finally asked. There are thousands of women who would gladly marry someone with your wealth. Alexander leaned back slightly. Wealth attracts attention. I am looking for character. You rebuilt your company 3 separate times before asking anyone for help. You sold your apartment before laying off a single employee. You paid every intern before paying yourself. Those choices tell me far more than your resume ever could. I blinked in surprise. You know all of that. I know enough. The room fell quiet again. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows while the city lights blurred into ribbons of gold beyond the glass. It felt impossible that millions of people were living ordinary evenings while mine had turned into something I could never have imagined. My attorney can meet yours tonight, Alexander said. If you decline, you walk away with complete privacy. If you accept, your company's accounts will be restored before the markets open tomorrow. No pressure, no threats. The choice is entirely yours. Somehow that made the decision even heavier. He was not forcing me. He was offering me a door that only existed because every other one had already closed. I slowly picked up the pen resting beside the contract. Its polished silver surface reflected my uncertain face. My heart whispered that I should run. My mind reminded me that dreams could not survive without sacrifice. I signed my name. The ink had barely dried before Alexander quietly closed the folder. There was no celebration, no victorious smile. He simply stood and extended his hand toward me. Welcome, Mrs. Knight. Tomorrow morning, your new life begins. As my trembling fingers met his steady handshake, I realized something that had never crossed my mind before. I had just entered the safest agreement money could buy. I simply had no idea whether I had also stepped into the one place I would never be allowed to leave. The wedding happened 6 days later, and if I had not been standing in the middle of it, I would have believed it belonged on the front page of a luxury magazine instead of in my own life. Manhattan's oldest cathedral had been closed to the public for the afternoon. Black luxury sedans lined the street for nearly half a block, while photographers waited behind barriers that none of them were allowed to cross. Every guest seemed to know exactly where to stand and exactly when to remain silent. It was the quiet that unsettled me most. Wealth usually came with conversation. Power came with silence. I walked down the aisle wearing a custom ivory gown that someone had somehow tailored to fit me perfectly overnight. I never met the designer. I never even chose the dress. Every decision had already been made before anyone thought to ask what I wanted. Alexander waited beneath the stained glass windows in a perfectly fitted black tuxedo, looking as calm as if he attended contract signings every afternoon and weddings every evening. When our eyes met, there was no triumph in his expression, only patience. That almost made everything harder. The ceremony lasted less than 20 minutes. The vows were traditional. The rings were simple platinum bands. The applause that followed sounded respectful rather than joyful, as though everyone present understood this marriage served a purpose beyond romance. During the reception, people congratulated us with practiced smiles, but many of them watched Alexander before speaking, carefully measuring every word. Some addressed him as Mr. Knight. Others simply nodded with quiet respect. Nobody ignored him. Nobody interrupted him. I began noticing small details that newspapers never mentioned. Security staff did not surround him because he demanded attention. They anticipated his needs before he spoke. Waiters replaced empty glasses before guests noticed. Drivers opened doors seconds before anyone reached them. The entire evening moved around him like the tide responding to the moon. It was not control through fear. It was influence built over years until it became invisible. Late that evening we arrived at the estate overlooking the Hudson River. Calling it a house would have been dishonest. The stone mansion sat behind iron gates surrounded by towering oak trees and carefully maintained gardens stretching farther than I could see beneath the evening lights. Inside, polished marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers while enormous windows overlooked the water below. It felt less like a home than a private world hidden from the rest of New York. A woman in her 60s greeted us near the entrance with a warm smile. "Welcome home, Mrs. Knight. I am Eleanor. I oversee the household." Home. The word landed strangely in my chest. Before I could respond, Another employee offered to unpack my luggage. Someone else asked about my dinner preferences. Every detail had already been considered. It should have felt comforting. Instead, I felt like an unexpected guest inside someone else's carefully ordered life. After changing into comfortable clothes, I decided I needed fresh air more than sleep. I quietly walked toward the front entrance, intending to take a short walk beyond the gates. The security officer standing nearby politely opened the door before I reached it. "Have a pleasant evening, Mrs. Knight." I smiled, relieved that nobody intended to stop me. But as I approached the front gate, another guard respectfully stepped forward. "I am sorry, Mrs. Knight. Mr. Knight requests advance notice before any travel arrangements are made." There was no raised voice, no threat, only courtesy. I frowned. "I am only walking outside." The guard nodded apologetically. "I understand. Unfortunately, I cannot authorize that without his approval." I slowly looked back toward the mansion glowing against the night sky. Nobody had locked a single door. Nobody had ordered me to stay. Yet somehow every path away from this place had quietly disappeared before I even realized they were there. The next morning I woke before sunrise, convinced that everything about the past week had been nothing more than a stress-induced dream. Then I opened my eyes to a bedroom larger than my entire apartment had been, where pale morning light spilled across polished hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. Reality returned with quiet precision. I was Claire Knight now, at least on paper. Downstairs, breakfast had already been prepared. Fresh fruit, warm pastries, coffee exactly the way I liked it. I had never told anyone how I drank my coffee. Eleanor noticed my confusion and smiled kindly. "Mr. Knight believes details matter." That answer stayed with me long after she walked away. Later that morning, I insisted on returning to my office. Alexander agreed immediately, which surprised me. Within 30 minutes, we were driving into Manhattan in a black sedan that moved through traffic with almost unnatural ease. My company's headquarters looked exactly the same from the outside, but inside everything had changed. Employees who had expected to lose their jobs were smiling again. Creditors who had refused to answer my calls were suddenly eager to rebuild relationships. Every overdue balance had been cleared before the opening bell on Wall Street. $50 million had erased months of fear overnight. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt unsettled by how easily one man's resources could rewrite so many lives. During the following week, I immersed myself in work, determined to convince myself that our marriage remained exactly what we had agreed upon. A contract. Nothing more. Alexander rarely interrupted my schedule. He never demanded attention or questioned my decisions. Sometimes he disappeared for hours without explanation, returning late in the evening looking no different than when he had left. The mystery surrounding him only deepened. Then one Saturday, Eleanor asked whether I would like to accompany Alexander to a charity luncheon. I almost declined before remembering appearances mattered. The event took place in Brooklyn inside a renovated community center filled with families, volunteers, and children laughing over art projects. It was the last place I expected to find someone whose reputation filled newspaper headlines. I watched from across the room as Alexander knelt beside a little boy struggling to assemble a wooden model airplane. There were no cameras nearby, no reporters, no speeches. He patiently helped tighten a loose screw before quietly congratulating the child with a warm smile I had never seen before. An elderly woman approached him carrying a homemade pie wrapped in a faded kitchen towel. Instead of politely refusing, Alexander accepted it with genuine gratitude and kissed her gently on the forehead like she was family. Several neighborhood business owners greeted him by name. A school principal thanked him for funding new computers. A firefighter shook his hand with obvious respect. Nobody seemed intimidated. They simply looked happy to see him. Confused, I quietly asked Eleanor how long he had supported the neighborhood. She answered without hesitation. Since he was 24. Every scholarship, every youth program, every food drive you see here exists because he refused to let this community disappear. I looked back toward Alexander just as he caught my eyes across the crowded room. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. His expression remained calm, but something softer lingered beneath the confidence I had grown accustomed to seeing. In that single moment, an uncomfortable thought slipped into my mind. Perhaps I had spent so much time believing every rumor about Alexander Knight that I had never considered the possibility that the man standing before me and the legends surrounding his name were were not the same person at all. For the next several weeks, I tried to convince myself that I had finally figured Alexander out. He was disciplined, quiet, and impossible to read. But beneath the headlines, I had discovered a man who quietly rebuilt neighborhoods, funded scholarships, and remembered the names of people everyone else overlooked. It would have been easier if he had matched the frightening stories the media loved to print. Instead, every day revealed another contradiction. He insisted that I continue running my company exactly as I always had. He never questioned my meetings or my decisions. The only thing he quietly refused to compromise on was my safety. A driver waited outside my office every morning. Another stood near the entrance every evening. I complained more than once that I did not need a security detail. Alexander only smiled faintly and replied, "I prefer preparation over regret." One Thursday evening, I stayed later than usual reviewing a merger proposal. By the time I finally left, Midtown had settled into that familiar rhythm of glowing office windows and yellow taxi cabs drifting through the streets like moving lanterns. My driver was waiting exactly where he always parked, but before I reached the curb, my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. There was no greeting when I answered, only a calm voice that immediately sent a chill across my shoulders. "You should not have married him." The call ended before I could respond. I stared at the dark screen, telling myself it was probably nothing more than a prank. Yet something inside me refused to believe that explanation. During the drive home, I noticed a dark sedan remaining several car lengths behind us through 3 different turns. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was not. I said nothing until we reached the estate. Alexander was standing in the library when I arrived, reading through several documents beside the fireplace. He looked up the moment I entered. Something happened. It was not a question. I handed him my phone and quietly explained everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more thoughtful with each sentence. When I finished, he placed the phone on the desk and walked toward the window overlooking the front gates. For nearly a full minute, he remained completely silent. Finally, he spoke without turning around. "Starting tomorrow, your schedule changes." I frowned. "Alexander, it was only one strange phone call." He slowly faced me. "Claire, people rarely waste time calling strangers. If someone wanted your attention badly enough to find your private number, I will assume they have another reason for doing so." His voice never became louder. It simply became firmer. I crossed my arms. "I am not going to hide inside this house because of one anonymous caller." He stepped closer until only a few feet separated us. "I am not asking you to hide. I am asking you to trust my judgment." There was something different in his eyes that evening. Not fear for himself. Concern for me. It caught me completely off guard. The following afternoon, my office received an unexpected delivery. A bouquet of white lilies sat inside a crystal vase with no signature attached. The receptionist smiled as she carried them into my office, assuming they were from my husband. I almost believed the same thing until I noticed the small handwritten card tucked beneath the ribbon. It contained only 6 words. "Contracts end. Consequences do not." My hands turned cold as I stared at the message. Before I could even reach for my phone, the office elevator opened. Alexander walked in with calm, measured steps, his gray eyes finding mine before anyone else in the room. One glance at my face, then at the flowers, was all he needed. The warmth disappeared from his expression, replaced by a quiet determination that somehow made the entire office feel smaller. Without raising his voice, he looked directly at me and said, "You are coming home with me. Right now." The drive back to the estate was quieter than any silence I had ever experienced. Rain drifted across the windshield in thin silver lines, while Manhattan slowly disappeared behind us. Alexander never looked at his phone. He never made a single call. Yet by the time we reached the front gates, every member of the household already seemed to know something had changed. Eleanor greeted us with a worried smile that vanished the moment she saw my face. I followed Alexander into his study, closing the heavy oak door behind me. The room smelled faintly of leather, cedar, and old books. A fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace, but the warmth never reached the questions filling my mind. I placed the white lilies on the desk between us. "Tell me the truth," I said quietly. "Who sent these?" Alexander studied the flowers for several seconds before removing the folded card and placing it inside a drawer. "Someone who wants me distracted." I shook my head. "That is not an answer." He looked directly at me. "It is the only answer I can honestly give right now." Frustration rose inside me. You promised this marriage was a business arrangement. You promised I could continue living my life. Instead, I cannot leave the estate without someone following me. Strangers somehow know my private number, and anonymous messages are arriving at my office. You keep telling me to trust you without explaining anything. For the first time since I had met him, Alexander looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. He walked toward the window overlooking the river, resting one hand against the glass before speaking. Claire, before I offered you that contract, your company had already attracted attention from people looking for ways to use your financial network. They believed your family's collapse would make you vulnerable. I frowned. Why would anyone care about my company? Because your grandfather unknowingly managed several charitable trusts connected to organizations that refused to cooperate with certain powerful investors years ago. When your business began failing, those same people assumed the records protecting those funds would become easier to obtain. I stared at him in disbelief. Are you saying this started before I ever met you? He nodded once. Long before. The room suddenly felt smaller. Then why marry me? Why not simply warn me? Alexander turned around slowly. Because a warning would not have been enough. People would still have viewed you as someone standing alone. A public marriage to me changed that calculation overnight. I searched his face for any sign of deception, but found only quiet sincerity. The $50 million. It was never only about saving my company, was it? No. It allowed you to rebuild your business while creating the legal and financial protection that came with becoming my wife. Every agreement, every asset, every security measure became enforceable the moment you signed the marriage license. I lowered myself into the chair, trying to absorb everything at once. So the contract protected me more than it protected you. Alexander smiled sadly. Claire, there has never been a single person on this earth capable of threatening my money. You were never the investment. Your future was. His words echoed through the room long after he stopped speaking. I remembered every moment I had accused him of controlling my life. Every time I had mistaken preparation for possession. None of it erased my doubts completely, but something inside me shifted. For the first time since our wedding, I realized Alexander Knight had never asked me to trust his reputation. He had only asked me to pay attention to his actions. And somehow, without noticing when it happened, I had already begun doing exactly that. The seasons changed almost without me noticing. Summer surrendered to crisp autumn mornings, and the trees surrounding the estate slowly traded their deep green leaves for shades of amber and gold. Somewhere along the way, the mansion had stopped feeling unfamiliar. I knew which staircase creaked in the early morning. Eleanor no longer asked what I wanted for breakfast because she already knew. Even the staff had stopped treating me like a temporary guest. They simply smiled and called me Mrs. Knight, and for the first time, the title no longer sounded borrowed. My company was thriving again. We had rehired every employee we had lost, signed new clients, and restored every scholarship program my grandfather had once funded. Whenever people congratulated me on the remarkable turnaround, they assumed determination had accomplished the impossible. I always smiled politely. Only two people knew how close everything had come to disappearing forever. Alexander never took credit. In fact, he rarely mentioned the money again. Instead, he asked about my meetings, remembered the names of my employees, and quietly celebrated every small victory as though my successes mattered as much to him as his own. That frightened me more than any anonymous message ever had. Feelings were never part of our agreement. Then, one cold November afternoon, I walked into the library and found a thick envelope resting on the desk. My name had been written across the front in Alexander's unmistakable handwriting. Inside was a single legal document. Divorce agreement. My heart skipped before I could stop it. The date at the top explained everything. 12 months. Our contract had reached its final week. I carried the papers outside where Alexander stood overlooking the river with his hands inside the pockets of his dark wool coat. The wind carried fallen leaves across the stone terrace between us. You already signed them, I said quietly. He nodded once. As promised. If this is what you want, everything will be finalized immediately. There was no anger. No disappointment. Only the same calm respect he had shown me from the beginning. Somehow that hurt more than I expected. I searched his face, hoping to find some reason to delay the conversation. Instead, I found acceptance. You are making this very easy, I whispered. His smile was almost impossible to see. Loving someone should never mean taking away their freedom, Claire. The words settled heavily inside my chest. I had spent an entire year believing Alexander wanted to keep me close because he valued control. Now, standing before me with signed divorce papers already prepared, he was quietly placing the decision entirely in my hands. The next morning I packed the last suitcase myself. Eleanor hugged me so tightly that tears filled her eyes before either of us spoke. Several members of the staff gathered near the entrance to wish me well. Alexander waited beside the front steps exactly as he had the day I first arrived. The black sedan stood ready to take me wherever I wanted to go. He reached into his coat pocket and removed the simple platinum wedding band I had worn for a year. "You should keep it," I said softly. "It belongs to you." He gently shook his head. "No, it belonged to the agreement. This one is yours to return only if you choose." I slowly slipped the ring from my finger and placed it in his open palm. For one brief second our hands touched. Neither of us moved. Then I climbed into the waiting car. As the gates opened and the estate disappeared behind us in the rearview mirror, I expected relief. Instead, an unfamiliar emptiness settled over me with every passing mile. For the first time since signing that contract, nobody was asking me to stay. And somehow that was exactly what made leaving feel impossible. 3 days after leaving the estate, I realized how quiet my apartment had become. There were no footsteps echoing through long hallways, no fresh coffee already waiting in the kitchen, no calm voice asking how my meetings had gone. I had wanted my independence back for an entire year. Now that I finally had it, the silence felt strangely unfamiliar. I buried myself in work, convincing everyone around me that life had returned to normal. My employees noticed the smile I wore during meetings. They did not notice how often I reached for a wedding band that was no longer on my hand. Late one Friday evening, I stayed in the office reviewing quarterly reports while the cleaning crew quietly worked down the hallway. The city outside glowed beneath a blanket of winter rain, reflecting thousands of lights across the wet sidewalks. As I gathered my files and prepared to leave, my phone vibrated. It was Alexander. For a moment, I simply stared at his name. He had not called once since I walked away. Neither had I. I answered almost immediately. Before either of us could speak, the line filled with static and disconnected. I tried calling back, straight to voicemail. An uneasy feeling settled deep inside my chest. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, yet I could not ignore the instinct that had learned to trust his judgment over the past year. As I stepped into the nearly empty parking garage beneath the building, I noticed something unusual. My driver had not arrived yet, even though he was never late. The concrete levels echoed with distant sounds that made the entire structure feel larger than it really was. I reached my car and stopped. Resting beneath the windshield wiper was another white envelope. My pulse quickened before I even touched it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only one sentence. "Now that he cannot protect you, you finally belong to yourself." I folded the paper with trembling hands, my thoughts racing faster than reason could follow. A familiar engine suddenly echoed through the garage. Seconds later, a black sedan turned the corner far faster than anyone normally drove inside the building before stopping several yards away. The driver's door opened. Alexander stepped out wearing the same dark overcoat I had seen countless times, his expression more serious than I had ever witnessed. He crossed the distance between us without hesitation. "Claire, come with me." There was no command in his voice, only urgency wrapped inside absolute control. I looked at him in confusion. "How did you even know I was here?" "I have been making sure you arrived home safely every night since you left." The answer stole my breath. "You were still watching over me?" He gave the smallest nod. "I promised your freedom. I never promised I would stop caring whether you were safe." Before I could respond, his phone rang. He listened for only a few seconds before quietly ending the call. His shoulders lowered ever so slightly, as though he had just confirmed something he had feared all along. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked directly into my eyes. "I should have told you everything sooner. I thought distance would protect you. Instead, it convinced the people behind this that you were finally alone." My heart tightened as the full weight of his words settled over me. Every sacrifice he had made, every decision to step back, every signed document waiting on his desk had never been about letting me go. They had been about giving me the freedom to choose, even if that choice broke his own heart. In that moment, I understood something money could never purchase. The safest place I had ever known had never been the estate overlooking the Hudson River. It had always been standing beside the man who had quietly protected my future long before I ever realized it needed protecting. Alexander drove me back to the estate that night without saying much. Neither of us needed words anymore. The silence between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt honest. The winter sky stretched above the Hudson River, clear for the first time in days, while the lights of Manhattan shimmered in the distance like another lifetime. When we stepped inside the mansion, Eleanor smiled through tears before quietly disappearing to give us privacy. Everything looked exactly as I remembered, yet somehow it felt completely different because I had returned by my own choice. I followed Alexander into the library where our story had changed so many times before. The fireplace burned softly, filling the room with familiar warmth. He opened the same desk drawer where he had once placed our contract and removed a thin folder. Without a word, he handed it to me. Inside were the original marriage agreement, the signed divorce papers, and every legal document connecting our lives. He placed them on the desk between us. "They all belong to you now," he said quietly. "If you still want your freedom, nothing is stopping you." I looked down at the papers that had once seemed more valuable than anything else in the world. 1 year earlier, I would have protected them with everything I had. Now they felt strangely insignificant. I closed the folder and gently pushed it back toward him. "I never lost my freedom, Alexander. I only misunderstood what it looked like." He remained silent, allowing me to finish. "I thought freedom meant walking away from people before they could hurt me. What I finally understand is that real freedom is choosing the person who never asks you to become someone else." His gray eyes softened in a way I had never seen before. For the first time since we met, the careful distance he always carried simply disappeared. I reached into my purse and removed something I had quietly kept since the morning I left the estate. The platinum wedding band rested in my palm, catching the firelight as I held it between us. I smiled through unexpected tears. I returned this because I believed it represented a contract. I was wrong. I cannot wear it again for that reason. Alexander looked at the ring before meeting my eyes once more. Then he slowly opened another small velvet box that had been resting inside the drawer all along. Inside was a different ring. Elegant. Timeless. Simple enough that it reflected exactly who he had always been beneath the reputation and the headlines. "I bought this months ago," he admitted with a quiet laugh. "I never had the courage to ask whether you would actually want it. My heart felt impossibly light." "You faced impossible negotiations without blinking," I teased softly. "Yet this frightened you." "More than anything," he answered honestly. "Because this is the only answer I could never predict." I stepped closer until only inches separated us. "You once offered me $50 million to become your wife. Today I want to make you a much better offer." His eyebrows lifted slightly. I slipped the contract ring into his hand before gently taking the new one from the velvet box. "This time, there is no contract. No expiration date. No payment. Just me. If you still want me." His smile arrived slowly, genuine enough to erase every shadow I had ever associated with his name. "Always," he whispered. He carefully placed the new ring on my finger, and for the first time it felt exactly the right weight. Looking back now, people always ask whether $50 million changed my life. They are asking the wrong question. Money rescued my company. It saved my family's legacy. But it never rescued my heart. The man everyone feared accomplished that without ever trying to own me. In the end, I did not stay because of the fortune he offered. I stayed because he gave me the one thing that cannot be bought at any price. The freedom to choose love, and the certainty that it would be waiting for me every single time I chose to come home.